Out of all of the things that we can experience as people, I think one of the most debilitating, joy-sapping condition that we can suffer from is what I call imposter syndrome. Where you feel like at any moment, whether it's, you're starting out in your career or, you're put in some kind of a social context or situation, or just kind of within yourself as you experience it, where you feel like you're going to be found out as a fraud, that you were just playing the part the entire time, and you feel inadequate as a result, and you feel fearful and anxious as a result of it. And here's the thing about this condition. It's not just for the people that are starting out in their careers or stepping into kind of a new season in life. It doesn't matter how successful you are, how well accomplished you are. At some point in your life, you're going to experience imposter syndrome. It was quite some years ago, Jodie Foster, as many of you I'm sure know, who was an excellent actor. After having just won an Oscar, had this interview where she talks about her experience soon after winning the Oscars, going to visit the campus at Yale. And she's talking about this imposter syndrome, and here's what she says. She says, "It was the same way when I walked on the campus at Yale. And I thought everybody would find out and they would take the Oscar back. They come to my house knocking on the door saying, 'Excuse me, we meant to give that to someone else.' That was going to Meryl Streep." That's Jodie Foster. She's basically saying, you know what, I do not deserve this. I'm unworthy of this Oscar that was given to me. It would have been one thing if I was Meryl Streep, maybe I'll be worthy of the Oscar then, but I'm just little old Jodie Foster, which is funny to say because she's an amazing actress, right? But guess what? This is what Meryl Streep herself had to say. She says, "You think, why would anyone want to see me again in a movie? And I don't know how to act anyway, so why am I doing this?" Can you imagine these words coming out of Meryl Streep's mouth, one of the best actors of our time? And yet, we all experience this, do we not? Right? This kind of insecurity. And why is this such a common human experience? Because this is a kind of experience that expresses to us a spiritual reality where we feel like we have to kind of cover ourselves, to be somebody that we are not, to project ourselves as somebody that is better than we feel like we are on the inside. And we do this with religion all the time. For so many of us, right, we perform religion to cover up our fear of being exposed, for being inadequate before the face of God. And so we live with this fear that keeps us from the joy of God's presence. We're going through a sermon series this spring on looking at the life of David and learning what it means to live a life of surrender and finding joy in the midst of it. And the question that I want us to kind of wrestle with by looking at this text is there a way that we can break out of this fear? Is there a way in which we can be fully alive in who we are without the need to cover ourselves up in the presence of God, and to be freed, and to experience the joy of this freedom as we live before the face of God? So that's the question that I want us to ponder together today, and let's do that under three headings. First, I want us to look at our deep desire, and secondly, our great fear, and lastly, the way to freedom. Our deep desire, our great fear, and the way to freedom. So first, let's take a look at our deep desire, and we get this in verses 14 to 15. Now, before we get into these specific verses, I want to catch you up to speed on kind of where we've been since the last time we looked into the life of David. Now, last time we were together, we looked at 1 Samuel 30, where we find that there was a crisis in the sanctuary city of Ziklag, where David and his men and their families kind of were encamped and settled down. And what we find is that while they were gone, there were marauders called Amalekites that came and plundered their land and kidnapped their family. But under the direction of God, right, these men go into battle and they end up winning over the Amalekites and winning back their family and loved ones. And soon after that, there's a battle that happens where King Saul, who was king over Israel at the time, who is killed in battle. And so to replace Saul, David is anointed as king, first over Judah, and after several years, he becomes king over all of Israel. And then he begins working on establishing the capital city of Israel in Jerusalem. And so it seems as if he's getting settled into his role as king over all of Israel, but there's only one thing missing. That was the Ark of the Covenant that represented the presence of God that ruled over the nation of Israel for so long. And so he begins working to bring the Ark of the Covenant back into the city of Jerusalem. And this is where we get to today's passage, where the Ark of the Covenant is being brought into the city of Jerusalem. There's a processional that happens. And what does David do? He worships. But I want us to look at the way in which David worships, because there's two things that I want to point us about the way in which David worships God. First, we see that in David's worship, there is no pretense. Verse 14 tells us that David, as he is rejoicing before God, as they're walking into the city of Jerusalem, we see that David was wearing a linen ephod. And here's one thing that you should know. A linen ephod was a very simply constructed priestly garment. Now, as king over Israel, what David was expected to wear, especially in a processional like this, would have been the royal robe. The royal robe represented David's status, his power, his dignity. And so it would have made all the sense in the world for David to be dressed up as a king. But instead of that, David chooses to do away with this royal robe and simply dons a linen ephod meant for priests. And this was David's way of saying, I'm going to leave behind everything that was impressive about me. I'm going to have no pretense about me as I lead this processional, right? For today, during this moment, I am not going to be king. And instead, I'm going to point to the ultimate king who rules over our nation, and in worship of him, I will lead this processional. No resume, no accomplishments, no status, and we'll soon see no dignity. He leaves it all behind. He simply brings himself in worship before God. No pretense. But here's a second thing that we see about David's worship, is that he has no pretense, but also no reservation. Verse 14 says, David danced before the Lord with all his might. Now, it doesn't quite come across in the English, but here's what it's getting at. It's as if the writer is saying, all of the power and authority and decision-making power that David had as king over an entire nation, it's as if he gathered all of it together and focused it solely on his expression of joy and worship before God. He danced with all his might. Have you ever danced with all your might before in your life? It's a jarring experience. I did it once in my life, and I'll tell you, it is not a comfortable thing to do. I was at a wedding, and I was one of the groomsmen. And during the reception, oftentimes, before the bride and groom make their entrance, right, the bridal party, one by one, make their entrance, right? And I was one of the groomsmen, and I was partnered up with one of the bridesmaids, and we were about to make our entrance, and, it's done to music, and you kind of dance as you go in. The only problem was my partner was so shy and was so nervous. And I was like, man, our entrance is going to stink. And so I said, you know what? I have to, in myself, make up for her lack of energy. And so I said, I'm going to dance with all my might. Only problem, I have 2 left feet. And I did not realize this until that day. You know how difficult it is to dance while you're walking? But nevertheless, I said, I am going to dance with all my might. And so I walk in and I dance like I've never danced before. And so I do my thing and I go back to my table And I sit down. The first person that I see is one of my best friends who was seated at the table, and he looks at me and goes, "Dude, what was that?" And then I look at my wife, my poor wife, she can't even look at me. It's jarring to lose yourself in that moment, and yet that's what David does. And he goes so far that his own wife, Michal, says, "David, you're like a vulgar fellow." In English, literally, that means you're as if emptied of your dignity. He had absolutely no inhibition, completely vulnerable and perfectly authentic in his exuberance before God. And the reason why I highlight this moment is because I don't want you to miss the significance of it. Because here in this scene is captured for us one of the rarest moments of a human being's experience. Because we see in this moment a person who is completely free in who they are. It's a moment where David lacked any pretense or reservation, where he brought his entire self wholly before God. That's true Christian worship. But why? What was the occasion? Like, what would lead a person to do this thing? And here's the answer. It's the Ark of the Covenant. See, the Ark of the Covenant was a precious relic that was, and it was a loss for a long time, but it represented the very presence of God. And so for David, bringing back the Ark of the Covenant into the city of Jerusalem wasn't just a matter of recovering and bringing back a national treasure for his nation. It was bringing back the presence of God so that the presence of God could take its rightful place at the center of the nation that he so loved and was tasked and called to lead. And this is a presence of God that David, through all of his trials and tribulations, got to know intimately. He knew David as a God who is, to borrow and adapt the words from the Westminster Confession in chapter 2. He knew a God who is glorious, perfect, pure, almighty, gracious, merciful, patient, abundant, transcendent, sovereign, wise, just, good, and true. In other words, to be in the presence of God for David was to be in the presence of the source of all that is true, good, and beautiful. And that's why David writes in Psalm 16, he says, "In your presence there is fullness of joy. At your right hand are pleasures forevermore." For David, this is what it meant to be in the presence of God. And this kind of experience was not unique to David. If you jump all the way to the New Testament, the Apostle Paul says something similar. He says, "You know what? If you were to give me a choice between life or death, man, I would have a hard time choosing." Here's the reason why. He says in Philippians 1, he says, "I am hard-pressed between the two." He says, "My desire is to depart, to die, and be with Christ, for that is far better. But to remain in the flesh is more necessary on your account." To experience the presence of God for these people meant to be in the presence of the kind of joy that is so powerful that it even expels the sting of death. You know, for those of you that are kind of exploring and asking questions about what Christianity is about and all of those things, let me just tell you as explicitly as I can. The unique Christian message tells you that Christian spirituality right? To have an experience of the Christian God, if you were to get to the heart of what that experience is like, the Bible would tell you that it's joy. That joy is at the center of it. I found out recently that this is one of the reasons why our church is called Joy Church. Because our founding pastor was convinced that even in the midst of suffering and difficulty, that intimacy with God leads to joy. Right? The kind of joy that leads you to drop all pretense, to be completely immune from the gaze of others, to be fully alive in who you are before God. Do you know what that's like? To be at peace completely within yourself, and to be completely at peace before the face of God, and to receive and to experience all of His goodness. Do you know this kind of joy? This is a kind of Christian worship that God desires from His people. But I have to tell you, I don't know if I've experienced the kind of joy that David is expressing here. Why is it so hard for us to have this kind of joy? I want us to go to the next point, our great fear. That's the reason why. And here I want to contrast David's worship and Michal's, his wife's, response. Because while David is rejoicing in worship, Michal is literally off in a distance. And the text tells us that Michal despised him in her heart. And later on, when David returns to the home, she sarcastically rebukes him. Look at verse 20. She says, "How the king of Israel honored himself today, uncovering himself today before the eyes of his servants, female servants, as one of the vulgar fellows shamelessly uncovers himself." Now, why is she behaving like this? Where is this kind of mockery and hatred coming from? And here again, the answer is the ark. Because see, the Ark of the Covenant, as much as it brought joy to David, he and everybody else knew that this Ark of the Covenant and the presence of God represented in it wasn't something to be trifled with. To give you a little bit more background and context into this text, if you just look earlier on in the chapter, we see that there was actually another attempt to bring the Ark of the Covenant back to Jerusalem. But at that time, in that first attempt, the presence of God was treated casually. And so instead of carrying the Ark of the Covenant back in the way that it was prescribed, they just kind of put it on a cart and just kind of, drag it along. As a result, a man named Uzzah, when he touched the Ark of the Covenant, was struck down. And that memory was fresh in the minds of everyone around. And this is what it tells us, that the holiness of God is such that you can't get too close. Merely touching the Ark of the Covenant that represented the presence of God struck Uzzah down. It tells us that the presence of God, as good as He is, as true as He is, as beautiful as He is, should stir within us fear. It's a terrifying thing to be in the presence of God. It's a serious matter to be in the presence of God, and Michal knew this. So she grew up in her father's house, where God's presence was treated with caution and with a bit of a distance. And she, like many others around her, saw what happened when the Ark of the Covenant was mishandled. So I venture to guess here, maybe deep down inside, she understood that God's holiness isn't something that you control, but rather that God's holiness, His perfection, is something that exposes you. Like sunlight, you dare not look directly into it. And that's a terrifying thing, to be in the presence of God. Let me make a confession as a pastor, and on behalf of basically every other pastor that I know, that every single one of us, we aspire to be great preachers. Now, when I was starting out as a pastor, I worked under someone who I believe to this day to be the best preacher that I've ever heard. And I remember just being terrified at the thought of me preaching from the pulpit like this on a Sunday and seeing my mentor off in a distance within the congregation. Just imagining that in my head stirred up all of these fears and insecurity that I had within me. Now, why? Why was I so terrified? Was it because I thought that if I preached a bad sermon that he would criticize me and mock me as a result? He would never do that. No, it's just his mere presence, his towering presence compared to, itty-bitty little old me. If that's the kind of experience, and we all have those kinds of experience, feeling small compared to somebody who is far more accomplished than we are. If this is true of human beings, what do you think God's holiness would do to us? See, Michal is not merely annoyed by David's dancing. No, she is threatened by David's dancing. Why? Because David's vulnerability exposed within Michal's own heart her need to maintain dignity, status, and control, and the fear of losing all of that if she dared to be vulnerable before God in the same way David was. And her disdain reveals this deep fear of being exposed. Right? She's terrified to be vulnerable. And so what does she do? She watches from afar, trapped in her own image that she needs to maintain. And this is what God's holiness does to all of us. Right? This is what drove Adam and Eve to hide from the presence of God after they took a bite from the fruit of the tree. This is what drove Michal to stand off to the side. And this is what drives us to work so hard to prove ourselves. We don't even know who half the time. And yet we do this. And the Bible tells us you're ultimately trying to prove yourself to God. So you work and you work and you work. Why? Because we know that we never quite measure up. And this fear drives us. So what are we to do with this? Here's the dilemma I'll tell you. Even though I feared the presence of my mentor so much, especially when I was starting out in ministry, man, I wanted his approval. I wanted him to come to me and say, Joe, that sermon, top notch. I desperately wanted to hear that from him. Here's a spiritual truth, the dilemma that we all live with. Our deepest joy depends on God's presence. Yet it is this very presence that threatens to expose and overwhelm us. So what are we to do with this? Because we have the same exact fear that Michal does. And so here's what we do. We keep God at arm's length, performing just enough religion to feel safe and secure, but never experiencing real and actual intimacy with God. Because we dare not bring our whole self before God without dressing ourselves up first, as we do with everything else in life. And this fear of exposure locks us in to our spiritual barrenness. And just as Michal experienced physical barrenness for the rest of her life, we live in the state of perpetual spiritual barrenness. That's why our worship does not fill us with joy. That's why our worship is not an expression of joy. Half the time in our worship, we're trying to muster up joy that we do not have within. It's not an overflow. We are searching. But here's the way to freedom. And it's all in this little verse, in verse 13. It says, and when those who bore the ark of the Lord had gone 6 steps, he, David, sacrificed an ox and a fattened animal. See, they are just starting off in their journey of bringing the ark back into Jerusalem, but we're told almost immediately, after just 6 steps, David takes care to stop and make a sacrifice. And it was a very meticulous process that most likely took a very long time and great intentionality. What does this tell us? It tells us that David's worship, as much as it would have looked a certain way, was not unhinged like it seemed to Michal. David wasn't just caught up in a moment where his emotions were stirred and he just let go of all control over himself and he just got lost in the moment. So much of our worship is like that. I remember in high school, I was a proud agnostic, but I still went to church for other reasons. We can talk about that later. But I remember, even me myself, if you stirred enough emotion in me, I would just get caught up in the moment. And I would just jump up and down with others, and oftentimes I would, have a good cry, and I would, experience this kind of emotional, it was like a cathartic moment for me. This is not like that. David was completely aware of the fact that this procession was being accompanied by the terrifying presence of God. He wasn't being emotionally manipulated. He knew exactly what was happening. And yet he experienced true joy. Let me tell you what this looks like. There are 2 ways to experience joy. One way is by getting inebriated, getting drunk. I mean, I guess it depends on what kind of drunk you are, but let's just put it this way. If you consume enough alcohol, it is entirely possible to produce an artificial sense of joy. Right? You're less aware of your surroundings, you're less aware of your troubles, and it leads you to a certain sense of kind of joy. But the other way to experience joy is not to be inebriated, but to be immersed in reality. That there's something so amazing happening in your life that as you soak in this moment, as you immerse yourself in this moment, your heart begins to erupt with celebration and joy. David's worship was the latter. Why? Why was this possible? It's the sacrifice. It's the sacrifice. Killing an ox and a fattened animal, this was what was called an atoning sacrifice, where these animals would basically bear the sins on behalf of the people and would be killed to make atoning sacrifice for the sins of the people. And here's the reason why David could be so open and vulnerable before God in worship. It was because he knew that as flawed and imperfect and sinful as he was, he knew that he was covered by the sacrifice. In other words, the sacrificial animal died so that David may live. Now, friends, if a sacrificial animal was enough for David to get a glimpse of the spiritual reality of God's grace and mercy and leads him to leap up and down in joy and to dance before God, to proudly say, I will make myself yet more contemptible, more undignified than this, then we, on this side of God's promises, can do one better. Because we don't just have a sacrificial animal, we have the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. See, all of the sacrifice is pointing us to Jesus, who became our great sacrifice. Because on the cross, Jesus Christ faced ultimate exposure. He hung on the cross, his arms nailed, forced open, laid bare, nearly naked before the crowd, completely exposed before God so that you and I would never have to fear rejection when we bring ourselves bare before God. And because of Jesus' sacrifice, you and I can be utterly exposed before God and find only acceptance and love. Friends, this is the good news of the gospel. That in Jesus Christ, God sees all the way through you. And after having seen you in your depths, instead of despising you and condemning you, God calls you his own. He calls you his beloved. See, I want us to learn what this means because I want all of us to be free. Because I want all of us to experience joy. Do you know what it means to be fully known and fully loved at the same time? Because if you do, that will lead you to joy everlasting. Let me give you a challenge. This week, I want to challenge you to take one step towards God in vulnerable prayer. I want you to confess before God openly the one thing that you've most feared God seeing in you. I know this is a scary proposition, and for some of you it's going to take some soul searching to be able to do that. But let me encourage you to do that because I want you to experience at that moment, as you confess and bring yourself openly before God, the grace of God in Jesus Christ will meet you where you are and stir up the heart knowledge within you that tells you that you are deeply known all the way through and yet are completely loved perfectly by the King of the universe. Friends, because this is the joy that is set before you. Friends, do not be like Michal, standing off to the side, missing out on the blessings of this kind of joy. But would you rather move towards the presence of God? Jesus Christ gave his life to acquire the right for you to approach him in this way. And let his gracious presence lead you to sing, leap, and dance in worship of him. That's what I want for you. Friends, I want our church to live out and be our namesake, to be a people that are filled with joy. Not the kind of artificial joy that is mustered up through emotional manipulation or through an appeal to the will or anything like that. But a joy that is deeply rooted in the gospel of Jesus Christ. May our worship not be about us, about what we can bring to the table, how we can feel before God's presence, but may our worship be one in which we are pointed to Jesus Christ, our great sacrifice, who leads us into joy. May our worship, may our life, may our everything center around this great Jesus, in whose name we worship. Let's pray.